Now we're going to work on finding a percent of a number, any number, not just finding 6% or finding sales tax. But if you'll soon realize that finding 6% or finding sales tax is really no different than finding a percent of any number. And I'm gonna walk you through just a few ways to find a percent of a number. But before we do that, I want to look at finding 1% of a number. This becomes really important when you're trying to find any percent. If you can find 1%, finding other percents becomes really easy. So, to find 1%, one way, let's say we wanted to find 1% of 400. So I want to find 1% of 400. Well, the first way is I know, very similar to the to 6%, I know that 1% is 1 over 100, and of means times, and I multiply it by 400, I get 400 over 100, which is equal to 4. So 1% of 400 is 4. Way number 2 is if I turned 1% into a decimal, I would get 0.01 times 400. My answer would be 400, but now I need 2 places because I have hundredths, so that still equals 4. Way number 3 is I know that 1% is 1/100th of 100%. So if I divide 400 divided by 100, which if you can see from way number 1, that's exactly the same as right here, I get 4. And the last way is not technically a way, it's just something that you can notice. If you notice, if I were to put a decimal in the problem, the decimal would be at the end of the zeros because that makes it 400 wholes. And if you notice when I said 1% is equal to 4, if I move the decimal 2 places this way, my decimal is now right here, because this also means 4. I moved it to the left twice because I divided by 100. And when we divide by 100, we've noticed that the decimal moves 2 places to the left. So that is a little bit of a trick to see what is really happening visually, not mathematically, but visually what is happening when we find 1% of 400. So, what if I wanted to find, what if 35% of 120 tigers wanted to eat you? You probably wanted to figure out how many tigers really want to eat you. So, you can find the percent in many ways, and we're going to walk through just 4 of the ways you can do that. So here's way number 1. We can change them into fractions. Remember, we're doing 35% of 120, so that's 35 over 100 times 120 over 1. Now some of you can simplify before you solve. We can divide both of these by 10, and that would make this 10 and this 12 if we wanted to do that. And that would be 35 times 12, which is 420 over 10. And remember, if it's over 10, that means that I need a 10th place, so my decimal would be 42.0, or we could say 42 tigers want to eat you. Let's look at it a different way. What if I found 1% of 120? So using any of the ways that we found previously, 1% of 120 is 1.2. And if you don't understand how I got that, please go back to the previous, in the very beginning of this video and watch how I find 1%. So 1% is 1.2, and if I want 35%, I would just take 1.2 and multiply it by 35, and I would get 42 tigers. The next way is to change them to decimals. So we know that 35, we're taking 35% of 120 still. 35% is 0.35 times 120 would give me 4,200, but remember I need hundredths, so there's my decimal, so that is 42 tigers. And the last way. The last way is very helpful because now we can, if we find some of the easy percents, then we can find 35%. So way number 4 is to find 10% first. So we're going to find 10% of 120. And we know that 10% is 10%, this is 1/10. So we're finding 1/10 of 120. And one way to do that is just to take 120 and divide it by 10, and we get 12. So we know that, so that we know 10% is equal to 12. And if I want 35%, well, I need 10% 3 times, and that will get me up to 30%. So here's my 10% 3 times. So now I have 30%. So 30% would be 36 because 12 plus 12 plus 12 is 36. But I need 35%. So I also need 5%. Now, we could go through any of the methods to find 5%, but if I know 10%, we know that 5% is half of 10%. Or I could say 10% divided by 2 would give me 5%. So 5% of 12 tigers is just 6 tigers because 6 is half of 12. So if I add these all together, here's my 35%. 35% is equal to 36 plus 6, which is 42 tigers. Now, this way may seem like a long way to you, but if they're pretty percents, like 20%, 30%, 50%, 70%, something like this might be an easy way to do those types of percents. If you're finding 37%, you may not want to use this way, but it's also a very good way to find percents, and it lets me see that you really know that different ways to find percents of a number.